Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture, which closes this term's New Models lecture series. The series, which began last autumn, has invited architects and other interdisciplinary practitioners to discuss how their work can change the models around which society is organized. Each event proposes a new model to address how we can shift power structures, socio-economic forces, and structural inequalities present in society today to give us new tools to rethink the world around us. Over the past year and a half, a series of new models have been presented to underline the need to redesign institutions, redress who has access to funding, reverse the lack of representation in public art, embrace physical and digital spaces of collective care and mutuality, find new forms of community or user-led practice, invent new forms of recognition, discuss new ways to excavate the past in order to deal with conflict in our present, and address the interconnected and intersectional crises threatening the future of our planet, with more to come in 2022. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Manijay Verghese, and I'm the head of the AA's public program, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, who through her practice that spans architecture, education, advocacy, and activism, has focused on becoming an active agent of socio-spatial decolonization for environmental, climate, and spatial justice. Tumpa Husna Yasmin Fellows is an architect and design researcher. She's a lecturer at the Bartlett School of Architecture and an architectural design tutor at both the London School of Architecture and Central St. Martin's. She's the founder of Fame Collective, who organized a fascinating symposium at the AA earlier this term around the barriers to architectural education for those who identify as female and minority ethnic, as well as co-founder of Our Building Design and the charity Manan Foundation Trust. Tumpa is a panel member of the design review panel for the Southwark Council Planning Department, and she was named a Reba Journal Rising Star in 2017 and has received several awards in her career to date, including a commendation in the 2019 Reba President's Award for Research and a Reba BAME Award, to name a few. Tonight, she'll present a new model for decolonizing climate-responsive design, discussing how to integrate indigenous knowledge from communities in the research and design process. By empowering those local voices that are often not heard, her practice aims to place emphasis on collective engagement and community participation. The social and the ecological are ever more entangled, especially in the global south. So how can architecture learn from other disciplines, such as the anthropological understanding of ethnography in the field, to enable community members and their drawings, models, and storytelling to be recognized as climate-responsive design research, as well as important forms of local knowledge? Before I hand over to Tumpa, a few notes on the format. She'll give her lecture, and following that, I'll ask a few initial questions before opening it up to the audience for a wider discussion. Feel free to post your questions in the chat at any point, and I can either ask them on your behalf, or if you'd like to ask them yourself, please use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, so that I can unmute you to ask it yourself. And if you feel comfortable to do so during the discussion portion of the lecture, please turn your camera on so that we can feel as though we're at least in the same space, despite this series still being held online. So I'm really delighted to have Tumpa joining us tonight for this talk that picks up on threads from other lectures in the series, from A New Model for Ecology by Natsai Audrey-Chietza from almost exactly a year ago, because it closed the Term 1 series last year, as well as A New Model for Design Creativity by Sumita Singha earlier this term, which looked at our role as architects in intervening in issues bigger than just architecture, such as climate and the complex ecological networks that we operate within. It feels really fitting to have her bring this term's public program to a close as someone whose multifaceted practice is really advocating for climate and spatial justice in a variety of ways. So please join me in welcoming her to the AA.
Thank you very much, Manijay, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to present at the New Models lecture series. It is so great to be here and to be part of a series of such important a series of discussions and lectures. So what I'm going to talk about today has been undertaken with the collaboration between my practice, Our Building Design, and the charity, UK-based charity, which I co-founded, Manan Foundation Trust. And a lot of the research is part of my ongoing PhD research, and what I'm presenting is part of a number of online journals that I've published. So it focuses on the subject of decolonizing design practice in response to climate crisis. I'm going to discuss some of the research, the methodologies, the tools, the methods, and ways of thinking around the new model of decolonizing climate responsive design. So just to set this out at the beginning of the lecture, the term decolonizing in this lecture attempts to offer a framework to re-examine, interrogate, and transform the system in which we practice design and we practice architecture, and how we teach design through a lens of an educator and a practitioner of architecture. So climate change doesn't affect everybody equally. This lecture explores climate responsive design by integrating indigenous knowledge from communities that are affected by climate change, attempting to facilitate the emancipatory agency of the action design research in architectural practice, enabling marginalised local voices by emphasising on their collective engagement. So there will be a series of case studies which demonstrate the improvisation of community participatory and adaptive architectural responses to social and ecological entanglement faced by the disadvantaged communities. Design practice as an active agent for decolonizing design methods for climate and spatial justice. By drawing on applied anthropological approaches, ethnography in the field that prioritizes community members as producers of climate responsive design research, and the use of participants' drawings, making, storytelling as methods of production of local indigenous knowledge. The research is undertaken through the reflection of my architectural practices, integrated within the process of architecture through participation and co-design, through a review of a series of community-focused projects in the remote Rajapur village in Bangladesh, exploring the role of a UK-based architect, myself, through an environmental lens in the context of social, cultural, and economic sustainability in the sites and insights of ethnographic fieldwork. So the Rajapur village is where my late father, Professor Mannan, was born. And this journey was an attempt to reconnect with my roots in Bangladesh after being brought up in the UK and after graduating as an architect in 2011. In 2011, my initial participations included engaging with community by volunteering to teach English in the local village primary school, an interaction which aided me to build a relationship with the community and to develop the brief for the building project, which I will discuss in depth, the Rajapur Centre, or Rajapur Women's Literacy and Healthcare Centre. So Bangladesh is vulnerable to the changing climate due to its shifting riparian characteristics of its landscape and its location. It is situated in the Bengal Delta, which has a moving territory between land and sea on the southern areas of the country, where the sea level is rising from the north, and from the northern boundaries of the country, the fresh water rivers born out of the Himalayas of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers converge with the Meghna River, are constantly depositing their silt, mixing with the saline water at the Bay of Bengal. The rivers are constantly eroding, depositing, sedimenting, compacting, contracting, evaporating, etc., causing the shift of the sand and the silt, which results in both loss and gain of land. Global warming causing an increased level of ice melting in the Himalayas exacerbates the shifting of landscape between water and land with periodic flooding. The riparian areas are most vulnerable to the shifting landscape, and its inhabitants face the changing climate head-on. These floodplains, created by the shifting of the sediments and the silt deposited by the rivers, are the basis for a productive ecosystems and agriculture dependent on the rich nutrient present in the silt shifted by the rivers. This is a very simplified explanation of a complex system of the monsoon and the landscape of Bangladesh. The context of the research addresses issues of extreme changing climate in this shifting landscape and the community's adaptations in the Rajapur village, which is situated on the southern eastern part of Bangladesh, falling within the deltaic floodplains that suffer from periodic floods, cyclones, shifting of landscape. And this is a cyclical change that causes a cyclical change of the ground and the water. And the ground changes by relocating, repositioning, rearranging, and displacing. So I'm now going to try and highlight some of the adaptation strategies that I've learned in the rural Bangladesh due to extreme climate conditions. So in this example, these adaptation strategies are basically invented by the Char communities. And Char is a piece of land that slowly emerges every 5 years, and it becomes an island, and people tend to settle in these islands through learning how to live with the nature and converting the Char Islands to permanent land by growing vegetation. So learning from the Char communities, we've learned that the roots of the vegetation stabilizes the loose soil, providing structural support to the riverbanks and preventing erosion. So here are some examples of floating gardens where the communities here have adapted to growing food when there is increased level of water in the flooding season. And this is happening in a large scale in order to meet the demands of the cities in Bangladesh. So after seeing and learning from the Char communities, as a designer, these had been translated into drawings and diagrams and been shared and disseminated with the community, other communities that do not have this knowledge. So how does it work? And it is used, basically this garden is made out of all natural materials. So the bottom layer is water hyacinths, and then a layer of bamboo rafts, and then another layer of water hyacinths. On top of that, there are some bowls created with cow dung and soil and compost, and then seeds are placed inside these small bowls. And then through the season, the growing starts, and things like okra, pumpkins, gourds, aubergine, spinach, and other source of nutrients are grown on this floating garden. There's some more examples ways that they have learned how to adapt strategies to ensure that the fish are kept. So ethnographic methodologies, they facilitate the understanding of what social and cultural factors are expectations need to be considered when exploring co-design strategies. So these are some of the other types of adaptation strategies basically invented in the Rajapur village, which is very different from the Char communities. Again, it addresses growing, for food crops, and also fish, keeping the fish safe during flooding season. So to gain ethnographic understanding of the community, its cultural practice, the surrounding landscape, and the changing climate, I began community engagement in 2011. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I started volunteering as a teacher, teaching English in the primary school. And it really gave me an insight to how people live and what are some of the social and environmental issues that the community deal with. And one of which was that the girls in the village, they were not encouraged to study beyond primary level. Education is not free in Bangladesh beyond primary school. So it was the boys that are usually encouraged to carry on, and the girls are left behind to help with the farming, or they face an early marriage. So I have instinctively participated overtly and covertly in the Rajapur village's daily life for an extended period of time as an observer, watching what and how the community adapt to the changing climate and some of the complex social issues they face. Listen to the villagers' stories and what was said, and asking questions and collecting information in formal community engagement meetings and informal discussions with the parents of the school and other community members. This shed a light on the issues that are at the focus of this research. The nature of the research and collecting information makes the boundaries around ethnography and other sorts of qualitative inquiry. And also I found that the villagers have a seasonal ritual of how they maintain their buildings and their architecture. And there is a huge presence of the older buildings to have constructed out of natural materials like timber and bamboo and earth, and also tin. They tend to use tin a lot because it has a robust quality, although environmentally during the heat of the summer, it is in a very comfortable space if it's made out of tin. But this was 10 years ago. Since then, I've been making annual visits, except for the COVID-19 during the COVID-19 restrictions. And I've noticed a different practices have been emerging in the architecture, and some of the local crafts of building with bamboo and natural materials are being lost. People tend to aspire to living like in the city and wanting to build out of burnt bricks and also concrete. So the next part of the project lecture, I'm going to discuss in detail our building that we have delivered in the Rajapur village. So out of spending a few years with the community and talking to them and doing some community participatory workshops, we realized there is a lack of access to healthcare in this remote part of Bangladesh, and also education for women. So as a charity, we had fundraised and delivered this building, which provides women's literacy classes and free healthcare services to the community. So I'm going to start by talking about how I got to know the landscape and the village. So we walked. So these are a series of maps that I have drawn. However, the information of the mapping had come out of this tool, which I and other architects and designers like myself who practice on the fields, on the grounds, use, and it's called a Transact Walk. So the map of remote places in Bangladesh is not accessible. These maps do not exist, and the only maps that do exist of the area are from the colonial times, which only indicate the legal boundaries of land ownership and do not reflect the conditions of the landscape and how the land is used day to day with the community. So these maps have been produced through a participatory tool called Transact Walk with the community members, and it is a very useful tool to get to know the neighborhood and to understand the water resources, the wastewater flow and sanitation facilities, which help the communities assess the problems and the opportunities in the neighborhood. So we walked with the community participants who know the area very well, and together we drew the outlines of the houses, the walkways by the rainwater collecting ponds, which are called the pukur, with a similar line on a large piece of paper. They collectively agreed on symbols to represent things like things which are important to the residents, such as the water infrastructure and areas which are causing problems for the community. These participatory maps were an important way to understand the neighborhood through the eye of the community and to document what is important and what they perceive to be a problem. And this is a valuable tool, and that revealed that the communities, through the community lens, the entanglement of the climate and the human and non-human agencies in the village. So initially, at the beginning, we had formal meetings with the community, and we've noticed that it's the elders and the men in the community that would dominate the conversation and would have, a say and express their opinions about a community building. So this became problematic for us because we realized the women were not being represented. There's been an underrepresentation of those who are from low-income communities and children and the women. So as we continued with our community participation, we used formal architectural drawings. Again, that had also hindered participation. We've noticed that people didn't respond to those formal drawings because they didn't understand the plans. And so, we found other ways of communicating visually rather than architectural drawings. And we did this through these workshops. We started off with those with children because we found children engaged in learning through drawings workshops, and then the adults joined in. And so the parents and the children, they discussed their vision of a community building, and they drew the outcomes of what they wanted. They exchanged their ideas, they copied each other, the village children drew their ideas, they translated their parents' ideas, and they drew diagrams and different types of building experiences. We also used hand models, which generated a lot of conversations, and we found generated more participation than the architectural drawings. The other methods we've used, which was I think was a very important tool in this process, was performing sort of spatial relationships with the site. So we walked around the site when we drew three-dimensionally, drew with ropes on site to understand the relationships between spatial relationships and how a community building would be used in this village. We realized, and we talked about this a lot with the community about the local materials. The Rajapur village has a large area of bamboo garden, sorry. And when we discussed using bamboo, we had a negative response from the community. They see bamboo as a temporary material because it rots basically in that climate. So we discussed how to treat bamboo, and these workshops became a focal point of thinking about how to create the longevity of this material. And this is what we learned from an expert in the village of what kind of different treatment methods that could be used to create that longevity. So people took part in creating prototypes and learning how to use this material and how to treat it. The other material we've seen that the villagers use, but it's the low-income households that tend to use this material as the earth, and it's usually the women in the village. They tend to build with their hands, and they tend to know about the soil, the quality of the soil, and how it behaves, and they tend to build their kitchen and the shed for the animals, and so we really wanted to learn from them how this material behaves. So we hosted these workshops with women to learn about using earth as a building material. However, when we tried to engage the women to come and join us on site, there was basically they said no, because in the way the cultural setup is that women do not go outside of their courtyard when they work like this, and they didn't want to work with the men on site. So we negotiated and came up with a system where the women would build their these earth blocks, dry them in the courtyard, and bring them onto the site for the blocks to be used as part of the building. And again, as designers, the idea was to try and disseminate the local knowledge. And so these kind of drawings were produced to share with the community from those who are experts of how to mix the earth, and also outside of that community in platforms such as this. And we did do lots of drawings with the community as we built. So some of the drawings happened on our feet and as we sketched and we built at the same time. So these are post-completion drawings, and just, I did these drawings after the building was built to explain the design, because the design evolved and changed quite a lot while we were building. So it was difficult to draw then. The site is just to explain, the site is part of rainwater collecting strategy in the village. So it's a pukur, which collects rainwater, and we didn't want to interfere with the ecology of the site. So we lifted the building with a material, concrete, which is not really used as much in the village, except for that is used for the base of the buildings. And it's another way of sharing knowledge and exchanging knowledge, where we had hosted concrete workshops to teach the young men to increase their employability. And then above that, it's all been made out of natural materials, earth, bamboo, and the roof is a metal roof, which is not natural, but that's to withstand the extreme weather conditions in this site. So the elevations also was very different at each elevation, depending on which way the cyclone moved across the site. And all of this information was acquired as we spoke and walked around the site, and to understand what the environmental conditions were in this particular site, and how the water would move around when it's flooding. So as the building is above the water, it takes advantage of the evaporative cooling in the perforated walls, bamboo walls and perforated earth walls. So these are some of our photographs of while the building was being built. And so this building attempts to reignite the love of handcrafted materials in the community. So some of the people who worked with us were quite old, because they are the ones with the crafts skills. And this is a dying knowledge that's going, kind of leaving the village. And we wanted to revive these crafts skills. And we worked with young men to transfer skills and knowledge between the community, so that the skill stays in the generations to come. These are some of the pictures when we first opened the building. So the building is used for, as I said, free health camps for everyone, and women's literacy classes. And so in the veranda, we have this sort of flexible space, perforated flexible space, which keeps the building cool. And also the thermal mass of the earth also helps to monitor the temperature in the heat. So yeah, we had some visitors from other architectural departments in Bangladesh. And so impact, in terms of impact, since we've opened the building, we had 5 graduated cohorts who have been able to acquire skills like tailoring skills and started their own business. And we also host regular free health camps. So basically this summarizes, or tries to summarize the process and some of the methods and tools that were used for this project, and the understanding of the entanglement between the climate and the environment, with the human and the non-human, and their surrounding context. And so, this is showing the transformation of the site throughout an annual cycle. And this reflected how we worked on the site as well. So during the dry season was when we could build and when we could really engage in the site. And the wet season, there was a period of pause. So the building actually took 3 years to build because we had a very short window in the winter of Bangladesh, which is in between December and January, when we could build. So we've managed to keep the flooding level, the same under the water, under the building, to encourage fish and the kingfisher to come back into the site, because that's what happens during the wet season. So after the building was built and opened in 2018, we went back for post-occupancy evaluation to understand how the building was being used and what other projects that the community was keen on taking on. And we've also found that the women loved the building, but some of the men in the village, especially the young men, they were I guess a bit jealous. They also wanted similar opportunities, but it is quite difficult to please everyone in the community. And for women, this is the first safe public space in the village and surrounding villages, whereas men have tea stalls at every street corner, if you like, in the village. So it's quite difficult to say, hang on, you've got the tea stalls, the women don't. But that is how it is. It's difficult to please everyone in a when you're trying to do community projects. So we continue to work with the children, and our work basically, it isn't just about doing designing buildings, which although we'd love to do that, but it's also to empower the underrepresented community members of the community. So children, we work with them to get them to be involved and engage in taking ownership about how their neighborhood is shaped. And so these are some of our workshops focusing on just that, through learning how to exchanging drawings and storytelling. They can express themselves, and they are able to invent or reimagine how their neighborhood would look like in the future. So these are some of the ongoing workshops that we do with the children. So to enable voices, to give them a voice in a setting of community workshops. And also these are our ongoing climate responsive design workshops with the women especially, and here we are understanding the different practices throughout the calendar. So these are 12 months of the Bengali calendar, and Bangladesh has 6 seasons, and how in each season, what are the different social practices that are embedded in responding with to the climate and extreme weather conditions. And we found that the responsibility of how to respond to climate change is not fairly distributed. The men tend to majority of the men in the village tend to go abroad or work in the cities. So the women are left behind to look after the children, and they're burdened with this huge responsibility of facing extreme weather conditions each year. And so these were our findings in these workshops, where through storytelling, through drawings, through craft making, the women expressed some of their concerns and what they're doing in terms of using their crafts and skills to respond to the climate change issues in the village. And also this creates a safe space for women to express their concerns and anything they're worried about. So out of that, this project was born. It's a very small project, and in the workshop, we created these tools which capture it. So basically, the flooding isn't a problem anymore in the village because of climate change. It's more the extreme heat is the problem, and during the summer it becomes very difficult to irrigate the crops. So these small interventions capture the moisture in the dew point in the when the sun rises, when the moisture level is very high, in order to add to the irrigation of their vegetable gardens. And then COVID happened. So the next part of the lecture would basically I'd like to share with you how we continued with the community engagement and community participation with the Rajapur village from remotely from Bangladesh, from London. It was very difficult because most people don't have a laptop, most people don't use the internet. It's very remote, and usually it is the men, young boys who with a smartphone with access to Facebook, and the women tend to have the small Nokia phones, which you can't communicate through internet. So we've identified local champions who had those means and who became our mediator between the communities. And we've learned, through those champions, and different times, different people became champions. So first, initially, we went to the imam of the village, who had a really powerful voice, who had a mic, and who could share really important information about how to keep safe during the COVID-19, and sharing the public health information. So we got there before the government officials could, because it takes much longer for the government to go into these remote areas. So as a small charity, we were able to have that access because we've already gained a relationship with the local people through other projects. So they were able to go around and talk with a distance and disseminate information door to door, reaching those who don't have phone or internet access. And then these champions in the village hosted workshops demonstrating how to wash your hands properly. And these are information that already exists in the public health in Bangladesh, but it wasn't reaching these communities because they're so remote. So, it was through another way that we could get this information to them. The school was closed for more than a year and a half in the village. So we hosted remotely. We were able to work with the local champions, and host workshops with the children. So the children could attend schools in the courtyard, run by volunteers in the village. And, we could organize that community with the community. So that was very important. And, these are some of the design projects that they worked on to raise awareness about social distancing through drawings and making, and also mask making. So some of the tools of drawings and making that we've worked on for the Rajapur Center building project carried through for the other projects during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so women were actually very active in coming up with their own ways of keeping safe, so they could meet as a group. So they're coming up with these ideas of how to improvise mask making. So the next project is my last project I'm going to show in the Rajapur village. And it focuses on another environmental crisis that the Rajapur village face, and it's part of their daily life, and it isn't flooding, and it isn't cyclone. It is arsenic contaminated groundwater. So the village is in this dark red zone. This is a map that's been published by the government in Bangladesh, and basically in the red zone, it's highly contaminated groundwater that is accessed by the village communities, and that's their only source of drinking water. And then this is how this sketch, very rough sketch to kind of show you how the tube well system works, where it's dug into the groundwater, and deeper it is, the safer it is. But the community, most people in the community can't afford to dig such deep wells, so they have they access shallow water, and that's highly contaminated. So in 2002, World Health Organization described the situation in Bangladesh as the largest mass poisoning of a population in history. As the highly arsenic contaminated groundwater is used for drinking. The Rajapur village is situated approximately 35 kilometers east of the confluence of Podda, the rivers Brahmaputra, Podda and Meghna rivers, three major rivers, and the neighboring villages have a number of tributaries from the Meghna river. So without getting too technical, the sediments, the Holocene sediments are expected to be relatively thick here, as the Meghna river dissected the delta plain during the largest glacier maximum. So research indicates in areas of the Rajapur village, the tube wells that provide access to groundwater have typically more than 20 meters, but less than 100 meters deep, with large exposure of arsenic. So this, if somebody drinks arsenic contaminated water between 8 to 10 years, that causes different types of cancer and causes adverse health effects amongst the population. And the immediate one is the skin rash and rash, basically breathing as well. So sometimes it's mistaken for asthma, but it's all kind of embedded into the system of where they find the water from. So some of the environmental stresses faced with the communities, as well as droughts and floods and cyclones, poisonous arsenic contaminated water as drinking water, that reshapes the livelihood of the communities so they're forced to adapt. So during the COVID-19, I kind of became this virtual person. I sometimes could join in this workshop. You can see my face as I'm trying to record what's going on. And if someone had a phone that worked, then I would join in. But in these workshops, they were hosted by the local champions to work on this project. And we've learned from the community how the water is embedded in the everyday life. And one of the things we've learned is how it infiltrates into the system of fish farming. And these drawings were really helpful because we've learned, these are mapping drawings, and we've learned not only the locations of where the tube wells are and but also the proximity to other things like the latrine, the fish farming pond, and how the cross-contamination could happen. And we've also learned something really amazing. So the women here are so resilient. So I've learned so much. Some of them don't. And one way to test that is by using guava leaves and squeezing it into the water. And if the water turns black, then it has highly contaminated water, highly contaminated arsenic. And if it doesn't, then it means it has low amount which you can drink. And the other thing I've learned, which was extremely important here, was these little prototypes that some of the households have improvised, and they have improvised these filters with charcoal. And actually, that's the difference between the charcoal filtered water and non-charcoal filtered water. So it's just really amazing how resilient and how they're adapting to what's happening. And these are my drawings, but I've translated the information from the community's drawings into spatial drawings to disseminate the information within the community and outside of the community. So this is a scenario that is a typical scenario in the Rajapur village, where the community have carved into the landscape, and that's where they hold the rainwater to mitigate the monsoon rains to avoid flooding. And the houses are quite closely built next to it to access fresh water in the drought. And they're raised with earth mounds to mitigate flooding. But they also have latrine, which are some of the houses very close to where they access water from, and also where they access the tube well water from. So these are workshops that led us to understand the conditions of how people are building, and also to share knowledge that what is the minimum distance that is safe. The information that already exists by public health in Bangladesh, but not necessarily reaching people in remote places. And the other adaptation strategies, which I was very excited to see, was these prototypes to collect rainwater in every household. They have these rainwater that they use in the extreme drought. So fish and rice are the main source of food and creates part of the staple diet of the village community. And we've learned how it's infiltrating into the fish. So the fish farming, because they're experiencing drought in the community, they are having to rely on groundwater, but the groundwater is highly contaminated, and then it's infiltrating into the fish, and the people are consuming this fish, and they're consuming arsenic through another source. Same with the crops, the rice that they're growing, and this is what's happening. There's not enough rainwater, they're using groundwater, and again, this is causing more health issues. It is very difficult to understand the scale, but if the community wanted to get clean water without arsenic contamination, they would have to dig over 150 meters, which is impossible for most in the community. So they dig very low, and this is the mostly highly contaminated groundwater up here. So that's the situation that I've learned from my own reading, as well as through the community stories and their drawings. So I'm coming towards the end of my my talk, and I wanted to share with you how some of the things I've learned had been in my research in the Rajapur village had been then translated into how I teach architecture, and embedded in my design brief that I write, and how what I've learned has informed my teaching. So, for example, we have been investigating the last 3-4 years different parts of London, and in this example, we have been investigating the effects of COVID-19 to the underrepresented communities in Peckham, especially those who have lost a lot of business during the lockdown. So after the lockdown had been eased, students have been engaging and talking to those people on the street who've been affected. And in this example, a student attempts to propose a design outcome that would help increase the sales from this store, because people can borrow these to be able to access, to be able to carry their shopping away, because the problem was that there has been a road closure and there's been a lack of access to these stores. So that's just one example. And then the other example, which was this student had worked with a local crafts lady who's expert in tailoring, and she worked with her and created these gadgets basically to promote safety in small shops, so customers feel safe when they come in by using the mask and the hand sanitizer. And our project in Central St. Martin's this year, we're exploring Whitechapel, and here this student had been looking at how Bangladesh comes to Whitechapel. This is an incredible project where the student had been reviewing what is sold in the Whitechapel market, and one of the commodity is Hilsha fish, which is actually in Chandpur district, which is in Rajapur. Rajapur is in Chandpur district, so it's just a coincidence that it is from the same area. And the largest farmed Hilsha farming happens in that part of Bangladesh, which is then transported into Whitechapel. And so she explores the environmental cost of Hilsha fish, and she had created this tool to imagine what it's like to be a stallholder, and proposes through her design the promotion of raising awareness of environmental cost of buying fish from abroad, or the commodity in the market. So she reimagines herself as a stall holder. And another student here, she had been engaging with the underrepresented community members, the Bangladeshi women in Whitechapel, and she's been incredibly good with connecting with them and hosted these workshops where the women learn craft skills, and she had managed to work with them, collaborated with them, and make this quilt, which represents ideas of what climate change means to the local community, and through the exchange of craft skills. So I think that comes to the end of my lecture. Sorry, I hope it wasn't too long, and I'm happy to take any comments or notes or questions. So shall I stop sharing?
Sure. And then hopefully we can see some of the audience. Thank you so much for such a terrific lecture. I think it's just incredible how a kind of visit to reconnect with your roots to this village in Bangladesh has like kind of generated so much creativity, collaboration, such meaningful projects. And I think, it was really interesting that every time we were talking about one slide, I kept writing down questions to ask you about the impact or the post-occupancy evaluation. And then literally like 2 slides later, you would talk about it. So it was very thorough as well in terms of taking us through that journey. And just really inspiring. I think especially in how you could give the local community the tools to actually like translate the knowledge that they all have into new forms of maps and kind of new forms of data that so many others can benefit from. And I thought that was just really amazing. And I was just wondering, maybe as a way to start the conversation or the questions, that beyond the projects that you actually worked on with them in Rajapura, like what happens to those maps? Like how do they get shared with a wider audience so that other potentially similar villages or other areas of the world where they're facing similar issues can learn from that data or can make similar maps of their areas?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we found we really had to address this, how we share our information or the knowledge, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So one way we found was a really good way of doing that is through printing posters and disseminating in public areas. So the mosque was a very good place where the community gathered, and also the school, although the school was closed, but it was used as a place to meet, as a place to share information. And so the poster was one way. And I think in that part of the community, the word of mouth is a very powerful way of disseminating information. So the Rajapur Center became, if you like, a hub where people were saying, let's meet there and discuss and share. So I mean, to respond to your question, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as, that we've worked out how to share it with other areas in, remote areas in Bangladesh or even Indian subcontinent. There are ways to do that which we haven't explored yet, but we are basically focusing on the remote villages around Rajapur. So it's not just the village that we're working in, but we found that is the surrounding villages, because of the word of mouth, they're congregating in that space, taking advantage of these free women's literacy skills classes and healthcare facilities. And also the idea of mapping, I think, is something that they feel confident in doing, because no one is, they're the owner of these maps, and I don't have those maps. They have it. They take it, they recycle them, and they share them. So yeah, I mean, there are lots of different ways of doing it, and it really does depend on how the community operates in the context. And in this particular context, I guess it's the cycle of making and drawing, and keep redrawing and keep remaking. That's how it's shared. The knowledge is transferred.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I loved all the maps. Like I thought they were just really interesting in how they were playing with different, I guess, like different projections of space and points of view, but also the way different levels of information were like kind of annotated and brought together. There's like so much embedded in each of those. I guess just to remind everyone to please post your questions in the chat, or otherwise you raise your hand and I can unmute you to ask a question to Tumpa. But in the meantime, I'll continue asking you questions.
That's fine.
Because there's just so many interesting things about your work that I'd love to know more about. I mean, I was really struck by the kind of gender inequality. Obviously, that's quite common in many areas of the world, but specifically around education and literacy, that I wasn't so surprised by that. But then I thought what was really interesting is when you were looking at the impact of it, that the men of the village became jealous of this new space that the women had, was quite fascinating. But I was wondering how, in general, the village responded to you as a woman coming in to work with them and to create this space of literacy, and like, you know, how the people, the decision makers in the village kind of, how did you convince them to like make this space for this public space for women when there aren't really any when you arrived?
Well, I didn't work alone. So just to mention, which I haven't mentioned, so the other co-founders of the charity are my mother, who is actually quite a respected member of the community, because of her age, I think, more than anything else. And my sisters, who are doctors, and in the community, doctors are highly regarded as, you know, somebody of authority and honor, and they provide these free health camps. So I guess it's sad to say this. I probably had more of a say than another woman in the village because the fact that I've come from this family with women who are able to, you know, visibly give something back to the community. So most of the time I actually worked with other people rather than me saying this is what we should be doing, because I don't think I had as much voice as others. So for example, the using of bamboo was, we've come across a lot of negative response from the community, especially elders, because those men who are part of the committee of the village, they are from very wealthy background and they want to aspire to living in the cities, and living in the cities does not look like a house made out of bamboo. So convincing them that, you know, bamboo needs to be tried out again, like it used to be 100 years ago, was very difficult. But, you know, we had methods such as, you know, we had brought in the research, we brought in the examples of other villages doing it. And, you know, they said, okay, we'll give it a go, but it doesn't mean that everyone embraced that in the village. You know, it doesn't mean that other people are using it as right now, but it's used, the building is an example of what can happen with local materials for those who we can't afford concrete or brick. So I guess with any community participatory projects, you're not always going to be able to convince everybody. But as a woman, I think the thing that I try to do most is to kind of use the local power, local voices to speak rather than me speaking. So I was actually quite quiet most of the time in those community engagement workshops, because it was important for me to enable others to speak. And if things didn't work out, if somebody, you know, one person dominated the conversation, then there are ways to intervene to allow other people to have a voice. But again, you have to navigate around that, because you can't impose your Western views, and you have to kind of, you know, I had to respect the way the community behave in an engagement situation. So how do I enable a voice of somebody who doesn't have a voice in those situations? I had to think about those outside of those formal meetings. That's why the whole brick making strategy came about, they did it quietly in their homes. The women built the blocks, and we brought them over, we embedded them. So they were empowered because they knew my contribution is included, but it wasn't necessarily mentioned in the community formal meetings, which were dominated by older men. So yeah, I guess, yeah, there's lots of tricks that you kind of have to navigate around.
I think that's so fascinating, because I think also you learn a lot of those while you're there and while you're actually having to work with them. And I think that it's probably for a lot of people at this lecture, it's really interesting to learn from you and your experience, like how to go about that. There is a question from the audience. I'm just going to ask to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Wonderful. I may have missed this, and I apologize if I have, but the building techniques that you did use, like, would you have classified that as a vernacular way of building, or is it just an alternative an alternative solution to the problems that you encountered? I ask only because, like you mentioned, the community of people who idolize living in the city, and a lot of time the city ends up being the focus of a lot of development and things like that, and they think of, like building with brick and cement, concrete, etc. Whereas the building with vernacular methods or with alternative methods isn't as glamorous, let's say. So I just wondered, like, was it particularly how can I say, was it something that was special to the village itself, like that kind of building method, or is it just one of the ways to find an alternative solution of building and creating better ways of solving issues?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question. So building with earth and building with bamboo is a traditional method that is dying out in the village, in that particular village. But if you go up north in northern Bangladesh, those are the traditional methods of building. So when you ask what is a vernacular, if it's a vernacular architecture, maybe it isn't anymore, but it used to be in the Rajapur village. So you can still find those types of buildings, but they're kind of not at the forefront. They're in behind another building, or at the back. If you go around the back of someone's house, they have a kitchen that's built out of beautifully handcrafted mud hut that's used for the family to gather and have their dinner at night. So it's a building. It's used as a material that isn't at the forefront of the visual representation of architecture of Rajapur village. And it's because it's this aspiration of wanting to be city people and wanting to live like somebody in the city, which has, sometimes does take over in people's mindset, because it's seen as a low material. Mud and bamboo is seen as a low material because it costs next to nothing to build with it. So when people have money, they want to show it off through different forms of architecture that cost money, a lot of money. So so to answer the question, it isn't a vernacular at this moment, but it used to be. And the idea was to find those, to bring to the forefront the low income community members who have great skills in making a building with mud and bamboo, to bring them to the forefront and enable their voices and enable their way of building to the forefront, to show as an example of what can happen, what you can do with the skills, with the local skills. And that was the intention of this. And because in our workshops, we had those with the voice wanting to build with concrete and brick, but those without the voice wanted to build with mud and bamboo, but they didn't voice those. It's only when I went to their houses and spoke to them, found out examples of their creation, that's when we got really interested and we wanted to learn from them, and brought them into the workshops for our making workshops that we did. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I attempted to answer it.
That's great. And I think really interesting that I guess that it's always about kind of who speaks the loudest in those big settings and how we have to invent new kind of formats to engage people so that those quieter voices also get heard. And I think that's really fascinating that you found that out only from having these one-on-one sessions. Sumita has a question, so I'm going to ask her to unmute.
Sorry. It's either the video goes or the mute goes. But anyway, Tumpa, thank you very much. That was a really, really lovely lecture. Really enjoyed reading about your, the way you're trying to work with local materials and local climate and local ecology. It's really beautiful. I just wanted to add, actually, to the last point, is that in Asia, there is a concept in the Indian subcontinent, especially in India, there is this concept of building materials being classified as pakka and kacha. Yeah, pakka means like it's permanent, it's superior. And this terminology has become ingrained in the West as well. You say if something is pakka, that means like it's really good, it's superior. And building materials were classified as pakka. So those building materials were brick, concrete, cement, all those kind of things. And then you had the kacha, which was the earth and bamboo, all the local stuff that people were using. So in people's mind, this idea of what is a good and superior material also took hold. It doesn't matter, there was thousands of years of experience of using that material, but this idea was pushed in just a space of 200 years of colonial rule. This was pushed into people's heads that this is the way to build. And what you're trying to do is probably and say, look, you can actually build with low cost, low energy materials, which is quite tough.
I think, Sumita, you've frozen. Oh, wait. I'm trying to
I've said my piece. I just wanted to make that comment, because of the earlier question, that what Tumpa as well, on top of other things. So, on top of the climate, the ground conditions, working with, very little money, primarily from donation, you're also struggling against this narrative of Western ideas being pushed into people's mind.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a really good. Sumita has put it better than I have, but it is a really good point to make that the idea of Western way of living unfortunately have reached Radhapur as well, and I have had comments like, you've studied in London, you studied architecture in London, and why are you now wanting to build with mud? So, it's seen as something negative in the minds of those who aspire to Western way of life. But you can talk about the environmental benefits, but it is quite difficult to change that mindset when people have grown up into thinking that the colonial rulers have the better way of living or displaying better way of building or architecture. It's finding love in the local. That's what we were trying to do with the people that do have that beautiful craft skills, and to celebrate their skills of making with bamboo and making with earth.
Yeah, because it feels like a part of the decolonization process is also getting people to unsubscribe from, I guess, maybe this I guess like the fact that like all quality and innovation happens in the West or happens elsewhere, but also there's a kind of narrative of progress that's tied up with imitating the West and these kinds of. I think it was great that Samita, you introduced the pucka and the kacha, because I think that those are really the terms that summarize it, like the things that we almost think are like rubbish, even though they're so sustainable and so much more attuned to the local climatic conditions if you build with them. So I think it's like actually, I think a lot of architects operating in the subcontinent have really struggled with trying to change like tastes and I guess stigma attached to local materials and like incredibly innovative historic like building techniques. And so, I mean, I think it was great that you got people to like really be part of the making process themselves and to take pride in these craft techniques. But you mentioned that quite a lot of these people are older, and so to skill up a younger generation or to explain that to them. But I was just curious as to what were other ways that you could like maybe shift the value systems or the kind of belief in like local being better than this kind of globalized or Western view of building and materials.
Well, to be honest, I don't know how successful this building has been in changing people's minds, but those who use this kind of methods of building in the village are from sort of low income communities. So when we've proposed a community building that is seen as, you know, as a lot of honor had been given to the community building. So immediately the idea of these materials have also risen in terms of their status in that village. So you know, it's the purpose of the building that has changed, I guess, attempted to change people's mindset that even an important building as a healthcare building and an educational building can be built out of local materials. It doesn't have to be the kitchen or a back of house building amenities. We brought it into the community hub, these materials, and that's in the middle of the village where the building is situated. So yeah, so that's one way. I mean, the other way is basically we really enjoyed making with the community. So we've hosted these making workshops. And one of the workshops which raised awareness about how to treat the bamboo, because there's a knowledge there in the village, but hasn't been transferred or shared across because there's the lack of interest in that material for its longevity. So I guess hosting those workshops, which are open and free to whoever wants to join, had created this scenario where people got to ask about this material and got to see, and also the fact that the building has been standing still, you know, withstanding the extreme weather conditions that Rajapur every year has to face. So I think I think it's doing well in that sense, and in terms of erosion, because that's one of the complaints. Oh, the mud has to be. There's a technique called lappa, which means it's like a plastering technique, and that's quite time consuming and labor intensive. And for the women, that's something they do seasonally, and that's something that they do as a community, as a collective activity. So again, it becomes a feminine building as soon as you propose a mud building. So when you need somebody to repair the building, not seasonally, but every 2 years, the men would say, I think the women would be better at this. You should employ them. And so, I guess, it's just embedded in the culture of who uses what material, and it becomes gendered, unfortunately. It had become gendered. It wasn't maybe 100 years ago, but it just has fallen in the responsibility of the women to build with earth in the village. And it's also to do with the globalization of men moving abroad, working abroad, sending money back. So it's the women who are in the village taking on the responsibility of climate change, and the responsibility is not shared proportionately between men and women; it's disproportionately shared. So I guess it's I don't know how to answer your question apart from the fact that it's embedded in the way people live, how they interact with architectural materials, and it's in the society. And finding love in the local is, I guess, one way of raising the profile of the material.
Thanks. I think it's just amazing that you've done like that. That through doing it, you've actually been able to convince people of the value of the local. But I think also weirdly the inequality and gendering of building techniques and like who's responsible for that has actually in this project really worked to kind of underline the aims of the project and emphasize them in a kind of really interesting way. So yeah, Samita, I know you have another question, so over to you.
I don't have a question. I'm, just another supportive point to Tumpa is that it's amazing that, I considered Bangladeshis to be quite, they're actually quite innovative and revolutionary. And I've just recently written an article about the Bangladeshi Housing Association Group. You're probably aware of that. And they were the first people through their action to raise this issue of direct action about housing. So they were squatters, and then they took over this building, and they fought really, really bravely. And because you mentioned the men coming over and working, so it was primarily the men who were living there, and because they didn't have their families, they were told that they'd be evicted. And this is an interesting point. They just made their point, and they won their case. And this was the first example of direct action towards housing. So, the Bangladeshi community in the UK has been at the forefront of actually fighting for quite revolutionary changes. And recently, I actually took, I was unhappy at someone who mentioned that Bangladeshi women were quite shy and et cetera, et cetera. And, I just fought back and I said, do you know this culture? Do you know this culture? You're making assumptions, and we also always make cultural assumptions about people, don't we? So it was just, a little sort of tangential point, but I just wanted to, talk about the community, Bangladeshi community that's actually living in the UK, who are also doing very innovative things.
Thanks, Smita. I'm conscious of time, so maybe to close the session, I wanted to maybe bring it back to your practice, Tumpa. And I guess in talking about new models, I think what's really interesting is all the many different things that you do, from the foundation to your architectural practice. And you talked a bit about the application of some of the work you've been doing in Bangladesh to your teaching. But then also, there's I think setting up initiatives like Fame Collective, there's so many different ways in which you're trying to fight this fight or transform architecture as a practice, but also the world around it through your role as the architect. And I was wondering if you could just say a bit more about your role as this kind of translator or intermediary between all these different groups, these different issues, and I guess it's a kind of new model for a type of practice. And there's obviously other people who are trying to do that as well in different ways. But I wonder if you could just, I guess, to close, talk about your practice and the different strands it operates across.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's, to be honest, it's not until you and I and Raj had that conversation, I realized the common thread between everything I'm doing, because I guess I do these things instinctively because I see something that I want to change, and I want to kind of, act upon it, to make the change. And for example, the work on Fame Collective, it's the intention had always been to, because I identify myself as one of those women who, of color and in this practice of architecture, who I sometimes feel are have the quiet voices and not always heard and not always treated equally. So what is it that I could do within my power to bring that to the forefront of people's mindset and also people's way of thinking and in conversations? And that's why Fame Collective started. But then what was really important for me was to enable those voices, and we tried to do those through different methods. And I've been very lucky to be able to have lots of different people who had volunteered to help in Fame Collective's journey so far. And together we've been able to bring to the forefront those voices, the quieter voices, and then broadcast it in Fame Collective events. And that was very important for us to empower those people and those people in the practice who are marginalized and in education, students as well. And I guess I was doing the same thing in Rajapur village without really realizing that at the time it was very obvious for me that I was outnumbered. I was one of few women in one of those community meetings, which I didn't feel uncomfortable about, but I felt that what's happening to the other voices, and I was very curious about that, and I had to find other ways to bring those voices to the fore, to the in the midst of making decisions. So, and those voices couldn't be broadcasted like we could do for Fame Collective because the setting is different, context is different. So they were empowered in other ways. They were empowered through their labor, through their engagement in making, through drawing, and those tools became really powerful. Those drawings that helped us make decisions, and those making that helped us make decisions about what is their architecture going to be like. So I guess, so those are different ways of practicing. But to be honest, I don't plan much when I practice. I kind of have an idea and then I try to improvise when I'm in the situation, because every context is different, and those who are being marginalized are facing different trials and different issues, and so you have to deal with them differently. And I guess through my teaching, I'm also thinking about the future of architecture, especially in the UK, and hoping that next generation of architects would be aware of those trials and those marginalized voices. And that's right at the sort of focus of when I write my brief, when I teach, when I have conversation with my students, to try and get them, to direct them to frame their work in a way that they engage with those underrepresented communities and develop their own tools of engaging with them. And that's been quite rewarding to see that, with a little bit of guidance, students, they're so creative. They find their own ways of engaging and with communities that are usually not heard. And we've had representation from the council, for example, in Tower Hamlets saying, well, we really want to talk to these communities, but they don't talk to us. But by coming to our students' reviews, they could understand what were the conversations. So we became the mediator in our teaching, in our pedagogy. So, so I guess there are different ways of practicing, and other people are doing it as well. I'm not saying I've invented this, but I guess I have my own unique way because of who I am and what my background is and what I'm aware of, the discrimination that I faced myself in the practice and in education, and I'm aware of that. So I will always act differently from someone who hadn't experienced those discrimination, in the sense of when I'm trying to make a change. But, I have hope that the next generation of architects will be different from us and they will direct the practice of architecture differently to address the underrepresentation, or in terms of gender, in terms of race in the UK, and also the underrepresentation of the communities that we're serving, especially in cities like London. I don't know. I think I've I try to cover the different aspects of my practice as far as I
it was a very inspiring way to end, because I think it's quite reassuring to hear that you don't always have to have a plan, but actually it's maybe more important to improvise and adapt and listen and engage and actually learn from the local knowledge and the people you're working with. And I think it's great that all of those ideas are being kind of transferred to the next generation of architects to hopefully change the wider profession and kind of the environment around us for the better. So there are a few more questions in the chat that I'll pass on to you because we've run out of time. But thank you so much, Tumpa, for such a terrific lecture and just a really inspiring conversation and a wonderful way to close out this term's public program.
Thank you so much for inviting me to share my research and my work. I'm very honoured to be here. So thank you very much.
We're delighted to have you. And I just do a quick mass unmute so we can give you a round of applause.
Oh.
Guys.
Oh, that's so nice.